The wagon arrived 3 hours before sunset, but Royce Barrett had been watching the dust cloud on the horizon since noon. He stood motionless at the edge of his property, one hand resting on the fence post, the other gripping a letter he'd read so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. The letter said she would arrive today. It didn't say why she was really coming. It didn't explain what her family wanted in return. And it certainly didn't mention the look she would have in her eyes when she stepped down from that wagon, a look that told him she knew exactly what this arrangement meant. She wasn't coming here to start something new. She was being sent away to end something old. But as the wagon drew closer and he caught the first glimpse of her face through the settling dust, Royce felt a strange tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with anger or resentment. It was the kind of feeling that warned him everything he thought he understood about this situation was about to be proven wrong. The arrangement had been simple on paper. The Ross family owned a strip of land that bordered his property to the east, 20 acres of grazing land Royce had wanted for years. When Thomas Ross died last winter, his sons made it clear they had no interest in working the land themselves. They wanted money, and they wanted it fast. Royce had the money, but somewhere in the negotiations, the deal changed. The sons insisted on one condition that made no sense. Royce had to take in their widowed sister-in-law Clementine as part of the agreement. No explanation, no negotiation on that point. Just a flat requirement that she would live on his property and he would provide for her. The letter had been blunt. She has nowhere else to go. This solves a problem for everyone. Royce had nearly refused. He'd built this life in isolation for a reason, and the last thing he needed was a stranger disrupting the careful distance he'd maintained from the world. But the land mattered. The land was permanent. People were temporary, so he'd signed the papers and told himself it would be a cold, practical arrangement. She would stay out of his way. He would stay out of hers. Nothing more. The wagon stopped 30 feet from where he stood. The driver, one of the Ross sons, the younger one with the thin mustache, didn't bother getting down. He simply gestured toward the back of the wagon with his chin, his expression somewhere between boredom and relief. Clementine Ross climbed down without assistance, her movements deliberate and unhurried despite the long journey. She wore a dark gray dress that had seen better years, and her auburn hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. She didn't look at Royce immediately. Instead, she reached into the wagon and pulled out a single worn leather bag, the kind that had traveled too many miles and carried too many disappointments. Only then did she turn to face him. Her eyes were green, sharp, and utterly devoid of the gratitude or deference he'd expected. She didn't smile. She didn't lower her gaze. She simply stood there, one hand gripping the handle of her bag, the other hanging loose at her side, and stared at him with an expression that said she knew exactly what he was thinking and didn't care. "Mr. Barrett," she said. Her voice was steady, neither warm nor cold, just factual. "I'm Clementine Ross. I assume you were told I'd be arriving today." Royce nodded once, his jaw tight. "I was told." "Good." She glanced briefly at the house behind him, then back at his face. "Then I won't waste time with explanations neither of us wants to hear." The driver cleared his throat. "The papers are signed. The land's yours. She's your responsibility now." He didn't wait for a response. The wagon turned in a wide arc, kicking up dust that hung in the still air, and within moments it was nothing more than a dark shape retreating toward the horizon. Royce and Clementine stood in silence, the space between them thick with unspoken questions. He wanted to ask why her family had been so eager to be rid of her. He wanted to know what she'd done, or what had been done to her, that made this arrangement necessary. But the look in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't shame. It wasn't fear. It was something harder, something that warned him she wouldn't answer even if he asked. "The house has 2 rooms, Royce finally said, his voice rougher than he intended. "You'll take the smaller one. There's a well out back and a stove that works if you know how to use it. I keep to myself. I expect you to do the same." Clementine's expression didn't change. "That suits me fine." She walked past him toward the house, her steps measured and precise, as if she'd already mapped out exactly how much space to keep between them. Royce watched her go, his hand still gripping the letter in his pocket. He told himself this would be simple. She would stay in her room. He would stay in his. They would share the same roof and nothing else. But as she reached the door and paused for just a moment, her hand on the frame, her head tilted slightly as if listening for something he couldn't hear, Royce felt that tightness in his chest again, and he realized with unsettling clarity, that whatever he thought this arrangement would be, he was wrong. The first 3 days passed in near silence. Clementine kept to the small room at the back of the house, emerging only to fetch water from the well or prepare simple meals that she ate alone at the narrow table by the window. Royce worked the land from dawn until his hands ached, driving himself harder than necessary, telling himself the exhaustion would make it easier to ignore her presence. But at night, lying on his bed in the larger room, he found himself listening to the small sounds that drifted through the thin walls, the creak of her chair, the soft rustle of fabric, the occasional pause in her movements that suggested she was listening too. He told himself it didn't matter. She was keeping her distance just as they'd agreed. This was exactly what he wanted. Yet something about the silence felt wrong, like the stillness before a storm that hadn't yet decided which direction to break. On the 4th morning, Royce woke to the smell of fresh bread. He dressed slowly, suspicion tightening in his chest as he stepped into the main room. Clementine stood at the stove, her back to him, sliding a loaf from the cast-iron pan onto a wooden board. She'd already set the table with 2 plates, 2 cups, and a jar of preserves he didn't remember buying. She turned when she heard his footsteps, her expression as neutral as it had been the day she arrived. "I found flour in the pantry," she said. "It would have gone to waste." Royce stared at the bread, then at her. "I didn't ask you to cook for me. You didn't ask me not to." She cut 2 thick slices and placed one on each plate with the same deliberate precision she applied to everything. "You can eat it or leave it. Makes no difference to me." She sat down and began to eat without waiting for him, her movements calm and unhurried. Royce stood frozen for a moment, caught between the impulse to refuse and the undeniable fact that the bread smelled better than anything he'd eaten in months. He sat. They ate in silence, the only sound the scrape of knives against plates. Royce kept his eyes on his food, but he could feel her watching him between bites, assessing him the way a person might assess a horse they weren't sure they could trust. When he finished, he pushed his plate away and finally met her gaze. "Why did they send you here?" The question came out harsher than he intended. Clementine's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Something that might have been amusement or might have been anger. "You signed the papers. You already know why." "I know what the papers said. I don't know what they didn't say." She leaned back in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. "My husband died 8 months ago. His brothers inherited the land. I inherited nothing but the goodwill of people who considered me a burden. When they found a buyer for the land, they found a solution for me too." Her voice remained steady, almost conversational, but there was a coldness beneath it that made Royce's jaw tighten. "A solution," he repeated. "That's what they called it?" "That's what it was." She stood and began clearing the plates, her movements efficient and final. "You wanted land, they wanted money. I was the inconvenient piece that made the deal work. Everyone got what they needed." Royce watched her move to the basin, her shoulders straight despite the weight of what she'd just said. He wanted to ask more. He wanted to know what kind of men would treat their brother's widow like unwanted cargo. But before he could speak, Clementine turned back to him, and for the first time, there was something sharp in her expression. Something that looked almost like a challenge. "But don't mistake me for someone who needs your pity, Mr. Barrett. I didn't come here to be rescued. I came here because I had nowhere else to go. There's a difference." She walked past him toward her room, leaving him alone at the table with the faint smell of bread still hanging in the air. And as the door to her room closed with a quiet click, Royce realized the silence between them wasn't empty at all. It was full of things neither of them knew how to say yet. 2 more days passed before Royce saw her outside the house. He'd been mending a section of fence near the corral when movement caught his eye. Clementine stood at the edge of the vegetable plot he'd abandoned months ago, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, a hoe gripped in both hands. She worked with a rhythm that spoke of experience, turning the hard-packed soil with steady, efficient strokes. Royce stopped what he was doing and watched, unable to look away. She didn't move like someone who'd been sheltered or coddled. She moved like someone who understood the cost of neglect and the value of preparation. After 20 minutes, she paused to wipe sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, and that's when she noticed him watching. She didn't flinch or look away. She simply straightened, met his gaze across the distance, and waited. Royce crossed the yard slowly, his boots crunching on the dry earth. When he reached the edge of the plot, he looked down at the freshly turned soil, then back at her. "You don't have to do that." "I know," she said. "Then why are you?" She drove the hoe into the ground and leaned against it, her eyes level with his. Because I'm not going to sit in that room and wait for my life to happen around me. If I'm here, I might as well be useful. There was no plea for approval in her voice, no apology, just a simple statement of fact. Royce felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot he'd been carrying since she arrived. That soil hasn't been worked in over a year, he said. It'll fight you. Everything fights, Clementine replied. Doesn't mean it wins. She pulled the hoe free and went back to work, dismissing him without another word. Royce stood there for a moment longer, then returned to the fence, but he found himself glancing back more often than he should have, watching the way she moved, the determination in every deliberate motion. That evening, he brought her a pair of leather gloves. He didn't say anything, just set them on the table between them during the silent meal they'd fallen into the habit of sharing. Clementine looked at the gloves, then at him, her expression unreadable. "Your hands will blister," Royce said. "They already have." She held up her palms, showing him the raw patches forming at the base of her fingers. "But thank you." She took the gloves and slipped them into her lap. For a moment something passed between them. Not quite warmth, but not the cold distance they'd maintained either. It was acknowledgement, recognition, the beginning of something neither of them had names for yet. "Where did you learn to work land?" Royce asked, surprising himself with the question. Clementine's fingers traced the edge of one glove. "My father had a small farm before he died. I was 12. After that, it was just my mother and me. We managed for 3 years before she remarried and moved us to town." She paused, her jaw tightening slightly. "My husband preferred I stay inside. Said it wasn't proper for a woman to do that kind of work." The way she said husband made Royce's attention sharpen. There was no grief in her voice, no longing, just a flatness that suggested the marriage had been something other than what people assumed. "How long were you married?" he asked carefully. 6 years. She set the gloves aside and stood, her movement suddenly brisk. Long enough to learn that proper doesn't fill a stomach or fix a roof. She walked to the basin and began washing the dishes, her back to him, signaling the conversation was over. Royce stayed at the table, turning her words over in his mind. 6 years with a man who kept her locked away from the work she clearly knew how to do. 6 years of being told she wasn't proper. And then the man died. And his family shipped her off like damaged goods. The anger that rose in Royce's chest surprised him with its intensity. He'd spent 3 years avoiding anger, avoiding any feeling strong enough to pull him back into the world. But watching Clementine scrub plates with more force than necessary, her shoulders tight with suppressed emotion, he felt it anyway. And he realized he didn't want to avoid it anymore. The rain started just after midnight, a steady drumming on the roof that pulled Royce from shallow sleep. He lay still, listening to the sound, and then heard something else. Footsteps, the creak of the back door opening. He was on his feet before he could think, pulling on his boots and grabbing his coat. When he stepped outside, he found Clementine standing in the downpour, her nightdress soaked through, staring at the vegetable plot she'd spent days preparing. Water pooled in the furrows she'd dug, washing away the carefully turned soil. She didn't move when she heard him approach, didn't even turn her head. "It's gone," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. "All of it." Royce stopped beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. The water ran down his face, cold and relentless, but he didn't move. "We can fix it." "Can we?" She finally looked at him, and in the dim light from the house, he could see something in her expression he hadn't seen before. Not anger, not resignation, something rawer. Or do we just keep trying to build things that wash away? The question hit him harder than it should have. He knew she wasn't just talking about the garden. He reached for her arm, his hand closing around her elbow, and felt her flinch, not away from him, toward him, as if the touch had broken something loose inside her. "Come inside," he said. "Please." She let him guide her back to the house, water streaming from both of them, leaving a trail across the floor. Royce grabbed a blanket from his bed and wrapped it around her shoulders, his hands lingering longer than necessary. She stood in the center of the room, shivering, the blanket pulled tight around her frame. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, "for being out there, for acting like a fool over dirt and water." "You're not a fool." Royce's voice came out rougher than he intended. "You're someone who's had too many things taken from her." Clementine's eyes lifted to his, and for a moment, the careful distance she'd maintained crumbled. "You don't know what's been taken from me. Then tell me." The words hung between them, a challenge and an invitation. She studied his face, searching for something, and whatever she found must have been enough because she spoke. My husband didn't die in an accident. He drank himself into the ground over 3 years while I watched. Toward the end, he blamed me for everything. For his failures, for his shame, for the fact that his brothers were more successful. Her hands gripped the blanket tighter. When he finally died, I felt relief, and his family hated me for it. Royce felt his jaw tighten. They had no right. They had every right. I was relieved their brother was dead. What kind of wife feels that? The kind who survived something she shouldn't have had to. He took a step closer, closing the distance between them until he could smell the rain in her hair, see the way her breath quickened. You're not what they said you were. And what did they say I was? Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. A burden. A curse. The woman who killed her husband with disappointment. Royce's hand moved before he could stop it, reaching up to brush a strand of wet hair from her face. His fingers grazed her cheek, and she went utterly still. They were wrong, he said. Clementine's eyes searched his, and for a heartbeat, he thought she might close the remaining distance between them. But instead, she stepped back, pulling the blanket tighter, her expression shuddering. You should get some sleep. Morning comes early. She turned and walked to her room, leaving wet footprints behind. Royce stood alone in the main room, his hands still raised slightly, as if he could call her back. But he didn't, because he understood now what she hadn't said. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of wanting something again only to have it taken away. And that made two of them. Morning brought clear skies and awkward silence. They worked separately through the day, Royce repairing storm damage to the barn, while Clementine salvaged what she could from the garden. But the air between them felt different now, charged with the memory of his hand on her face and the questions neither had asked. By late afternoon, Royce found himself standing at the barn door, watching her work. She'd tied her hair back with a piece of cloth and dirt smudged her cheek. She looked nothing like the broken woman who'd arrived in a wagon. She looked alive. The sound of hoofbeats made them both turn. 2 riders approached from the east, and Royce's stomach dropped when he recognized them. The Ross brothers. He walked toward them, positioning himself between the riders and Clementine. The older brother, Marcus, reined in his horse and looked past Royce toward where Clementine stood frozen near the garden. We need to speak with her, Marcus said. About what? Royce kept his voice level, but his hands curled into fists at his sides. Family business. Doesn't concern you. She lives on my property now. That makes it my concern. Marcus's expression hardened. We received word from town. There are questions about our brother's death. Questions about his wife. The words hung in the air like a threat. Royce felt Clementine move behind him, heard her sharp intake of breath. What kind of questions? She asked, her voice steadier than he expected. The younger brother spoke up, his tone dripping with false sympathy. Doctor says Thomas had bruising that didn't match the fall. Says someone might have helped him down those stairs. Royce spun to look at Clementine. Her face had gone white, but her eyes blazed. I didn't touch him. He fell because he was drunk, same as he'd been falling for 3 years. That's not what folks are saying, Marcus replied. They're saying you had reason. They're saying he'd been cruel to you, that you wanted out. Everyone wanted out of that marriage, Clementine shot back, including your brother. But I didn't kill him. I just stopped trying to save him from himself. The older brother leaned forward in his saddle. Then you'll come back to town and answer their questions properly. Clear your name. No. Royce's voice cut through the tension like a blade. She's not going anywhere. Marcus's eyes narrowed. You don't have a say in this, Barrett. She's family. Our responsibility. She was your responsibility when you shipped her here like unwanted cargo. You gave up that claim when you signed those papers. Royce took a step forward, his shoulders squared. Now you need to leave my property. The 2 brothers exchanged glances. The younger one's hand drifted toward his hip, and Royce saw the gun holstered there. His own pulse kicked up, but he didn't move. This isn't over, Marcus said finally. Sheriff will want to talk to her. You can't keep her hidden out here forever. I'm not hiding her. I'm protecting her. There's a difference. The brothers wheeled their horses around, kicking up dust as they rode away. Royce didn't turn until they disappeared over the ridge. When he finally looked at Clementine, she was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. You shouldn't have done that, she said quietly. Why did they really send you here? He asked, ignoring her protest. Because they needed you gone before anyone started asking questions? Clementine's throat worked as she swallowed. They told me if I left quietly, they'd make sure no one looked too closely at how Thomas died. They said they'd protect me. Her laugh was bitter. I should have known they were just buying time to build a case against me. Royce felt cold certainty settle in his chest. She'd been set up, sent away not as mercy but as preparation, and now they were coming back to finish what they'd started. That night, neither of them slept. Royce sat at the table, cleaning a rifle he hadn't touched in 3 years, while Clementine paced the small space between her room and the window. Finally, she stopped in front of him, her arms crossed tight against her chest. "You need to know what really happened," she said. Royce looked up from the rifle. "I'm listening." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat, her hands flat on the table. Thomas was drunk the night he died. Nothing new about that. But he was angry too. Angrier than usual. His brothers had refused to lend him more money and he blamed me for it. Said I'd turned them against him. Her voice remained steady, but her knuckles went white. He came at me. Not the first time, but that night I didn't just stand there and take it. I pushed him away. He stumbled backward, lost his footing at the top of the stairs and fell. She met Royce's eyes. I didn't push him down, but I didn't try to catch him either. I just watched him fall. The silence stretched between them. Royce set the rifle aside and leaned forward. And his brothers know this? They suspected. After the funeral, Marcus asked me point blank if I'd push Thomas. I told him the truth. He said he'd keep it quiet if I cooperated with their plans. If I left without causing trouble. Her jaw tightened. I thought cooperation meant safety. I was wrong. Royce's hands curled into fists on the table. They were never going to protect you. They needed you gone so they could control the story. I know that now. She looked down at her hands. But what can I do? If the sheriff comes, if they've already convinced people I'm guilty, my word won't matter. They'll hang me based on suspicion alone. The weight of those words settled over them like a physical thing. Royce had seen it happen before. Seen people convicted on rumor and circumstantial whispers, especially when the accused was someone society already wanted to punish. A woman who didn't grieve properly. A woman who'd felt relief at her husband's death. She'd be condemned before she ever spoke in her own defense. "Then we make sure you're not here when they come," Royce said. Clementine's head snapped up. "Run? That'll only make me look guilty. Staying makes you dead." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I have contacts, people who owe me favors. We can get you somewhere safe until this settles." "It won't settle. You know that." Her fingers turned beneath his, gripping his hand. "Men like Marcus don't let things go. They'll hunt me across territories if they have to. Then I'll go with you." The words came out before Royce could stop them. But once spoken, he didn't want to take them back. Clementine stared at him, her eyes wide. "You don't even know me. Why would you risk everything?" "Because 3 years ago, I watched someone I cared about get destroyed by lies, and I did nothing to stop it." Royce's voice went rough. "I told myself it wasn't my fight, that getting involved would only make things worse. I was wrong then. I'm not making that mistake again." Clementine's breath caught. What happened 3 years ago? Royce pulled his hand back, the memory cutting through him. "My brother. He was accused of stealing from the man he worked for. He swore he was innocent, begged me to stand with him. But I was building this place, trying to stay clear of town politics. I told him to handle it himself." His throat tightened. "They hanged him 2 weeks later. I found out afterward the real thief had been the owner's son. By then it was too late." The confession hung between them, raw and bleeding. Clementine reached across the table now, her hand finding his. "That's why you live out here alone. That's why I won't stand by again." He gripped her hand, his eyes locked on hers. "Whatever happens, you're not facing this alone." She opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of horses approaching froze them both. Multiple riders, moving fast. Royce was on his feet instantly, grabbing the rifle. Through the window he could see torches in the darkness, at least 6 men, and at the front, wearing a badge that glinted in the firelight, rode the sheriff. They'd come sooner than expected, and they'd brought enough men to make sure Clementine didn't have a choice about leaving. Royce stepped onto the porch before the riders could dismount, the rifle held loose, but ready. The sheriff was a heavy-set man with a gray beard and eyes that had seen too many bad situations. He raised one hand in a gesture meant to be peaceable, but the 5 men flanking him kept their hands near their weapons. "Barrett," the sheriff said, We're here for Clementine Ross. Need to ask her some questions about her husband's death. Questions can wait until morning, Royce replied. When you come alone, without an armed escort. Can't do that. We've got witnesses say she threatened Thomas Ross. Say she pushed him. This needs sorting now. Marcus Ross sat on one of the horses at the back, his face half hidden in shadow but his satisfaction visible even in the dim light. He'd brought the law, but he'd made sure to stack it in his favor. She didn't threaten anyone, Royce said, and she didn't push anyone. Thomas Ross was drunk. He fell. That's what happened. The sheriff shifted in his saddle. That's for a judge to decide. Right now, I need her to come with us. Peacefully. She's not going. Royce's voice dropped lower. Not tonight, not with this mob. One of the men behind the sheriff spoke up, his voice rough. You protecting a killer, Barrett? That what this is? I'm protecting an innocent woman from a lynching dressed up as justice. Royce took a step forward, and several of the men tensed. You want to question her? Fine. Come back in daylight. Come alone. We'll talk. The sheriff's expression hardened. I've got a job to do. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Then do your job right. Royce's finger moved closer to the rifle's trigger. Ask yourself why Marcus Ross is so eager to have his sister-in-law arrested. Ask yourself who benefits from her being gone. The law benefits, Marcus called out. Justice benefits. Or are you saying the law doesn't apply to women who murder their husbands? Royce's jaw clenched. I'm saying the law shouldn't be a weapon for men who want to steal their brother's widow's inheritance. The words landed like a blow. Several of the riders exchanged glances, and the sheriff's eyes narrowed. What inheritance? Royce had been gambling on a hunch, but the way Marcus's face changed told him he'd been right. The 20 acres you sold me, that land didn't belong to Thomas's brothers. It belonged to Thomas, which means it should have gone to his widow, not to the men who forced her to leave so they could pocket the money. The sheriff turned in his saddle to look at Marcus. That true? The land was family property, Marcus said quickly. She had no claim. She was his wife. That's claim enough. Royce's voice cut through the night. You stole her inheritance, then tried to frame her for murder so she couldn't fight back. That's what this is really about. The sheriff studied Marcus for a long moment, then looked back at Royce. If that's true, I'll need to see the deed. The original one. I have it inside, Royce lied. He didn't, but he'd buy time any way he could. Then fetch it, and bring Mrs. Ross out where we can see her. If she's got nothing to hide, she can speak for herself. Royce turned his head slightly, speaking toward the door without taking his eyes off the armed men. Clementine, come out here. The door opened, and she stepped onto the porch, her spine straight despite the fear he knew she must be feeling. The torchlight caught her face, showing the determination there, and Royce felt something fierce and protective surge through him. Mrs. Ross, the sheriff said, did you push your husband down those stairs? No, Clementine said clearly. He fell. He was drunk, and he fell. I didn't mourn him the way his family thought I should, and that's my crime. Nothing more. The sheriff rubbed his beard, his gaze moving between her, Royce, and Marcus. This is messy. Going to need time to sort through it proper. Take all the time you need, Royce said. But she stays here, where she's safe. Marcus started to protest, but the sheriff held up a hand. We'll come back tomorrow, in daylight, like Barrett said. He turned his horse. And Marcus, you better hope that deed says what you claim it does. The riders left, their torches fading into the darkness. Royce didn't lower the rifle until they were completely gone. When he finally looked at Clementine, she was shaking, not with fear, with something else entirely. You lied about the deed, she said. I did. They'll be back tomorrow. I know. She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could feel the heat of her. Why did you do that? You could have just handed me over. Royce set the rifle aside and looked at her, really looked at her. Because you're not a burden. Clementine Ross, you never were. You're exactly the treasure I didn't know I needed. And when she reached up and pulled his face down to hers, he didn't resist. The kiss broke something open between them. Years of loneliness and fear spilling out in the way their hands found each other, the way they held on as if letting go meant drowning. When they finally pulled apart, Clementine rested her forehead against his chest, her breath coming in uneven gasps. Tomorrow they'll come back, she whispered, and we won't have proof. Royce's arms tightened around her. Then we find it tonight. They spent the hours before dawn going through every paper Royce had from the land transaction, spreading documents across the table by lamplight. Clementine's sharp eyes caught what Royce had missed, a clause buried in the sale agreement that referenced the original deed being held in trust at the land office in town. If the original deed names Thomas as sole owner, she said, tracing the words with her finger, then the inheritance law is clear. As his widow, the property should have transferred to me, not to his brothers. Unless they claimed you abandoned your rights when you left. Royce rubbed his jaw. That's probably what they'll argue. I didn't abandon anything. I was coerced into leaving. Her eyes met his. We need that original deed, before the sheriff comes back. Royce made a decision. The land office opens at dawn. I'll ride in, get the document, and be back before noon. They'll be watching the roads. Marcus will have men posted. I know the back trails. They won't see me. He stood, already moving toward the door, but Clementine caught his arm. If something happens to you because of me, I'll never forgive myself. He turned back and cupped her face in both hands. Nothing's going to happen. I'm coming back. We're finishing this together. The ride to town took 2 hours through rough terrain, but Royce made it unseen. The land office clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, seemed nervous when Royce explained what he needed. The Ross brothers were here yesterday, the clerk said quietly, asking about that same deed. I told them it was sealed as part of an estate matter. Can you unseal it? For the widow? Yes. For you? No. The clerk glanced toward the door. But if Mrs. Ross were to come herself, I could release it to her directly. Royce's jaw tightened. She can't come into town right now. There are men who want her arrested on false charges. The clerk hesitated, then lowered his voice. I heard about that. Heard what they're saying she did. But I also heard what Thomas Ross was like when he drank. Most folks in town knew he was headed for a bad end. He pulled a key from his desk drawer. If someone were to wait outside and if that deed happened to fall out a window, well, I wouldn't know anything about it. 10 minutes later, Royce rode back toward his property with the original deed secured in his coat. The document was clear. Thomas Ross had inherited the land from his father as the eldest son. Upon his death with no children, the property legally belonged to his widow. The sale to Royce had been fraudulent. The brothers had stolen from their own sister-in-law and then tried to frame her for murder to cover their crime. Royce arrived home to find the sheriff already there, along with 2 deputies, but notably without Marcus Ross. Clementine stood on the porch, her face pale but composed. The sheriff looked relieved when he saw Royce. Good timing. I've got questions that need answering. Royce dismounted and pulled the deed from his coat. I've got answers. He unfolded the document and held it up. Original deed to the 20 acres. Signed over to Thomas Ross 15 years ago. No mention of his brothers having any claim, which means when Thomas died, this land became Clementine's by law. The sheriff took the deed, examined it carefully, then looked at Clementine. Why didn't you say something when they tried to sell it? Because they told me if I left quietly and signed papers saying I'd abandoned all claims, they'd make sure no one looked too closely at how Thomas died. They said it was the only way I'd stay safe. Her voice strengthened. They lied. They were never going to protect me. They just wanted me gone so they could steal what was mine and blame me for their brother's death. The sheriff folded the deed slowly. I'm going to need statements from both of you, written and signed, and I'll be bringing Marcus and his brother in for questioning about fraud and attempted theft. He looked at Clementine, his expression softer. Ma'am, I'm sorry you got caught up in this. You're free to stay here or go wherever you please. No charges against you. When the sheriff left, Clementine turned to Royce, tears streaming down her face. Not tears of fear this time, tears of release. It's over, she said. It's really over. Royce pulled her close. No, it's just beginning. 2 months later, the vegetable plot bloomed with new growth, the soil rich and properly worked. The legal papers had been refiled with Clementine's name on both properties, the 20 acres she'd inherited, and the land Royce owned. They'd married quietly 3 weeks after the Ross brothers were sentenced for fraud, with the land office clerk serving as witness. Clementine stood in the garden now, her hands dirty and her hair falling loose from its tie, and Royce watched her from the porch with something close to wonder. She'd been sent here as punishment, as something unwanted and discarded, but she'd become the foundation of everything he'd been too afraid to build. She looked up, caught him staring, and smiled. Not the careful, guarded expression she'd worn when she arrived. A real smile, full of hope and future and the knowledge that she was finally, truly home. Royce smiled back and walked toward her, ready to help her finish planting seeds that would grow into something neither of them had dared to dream of before. Together, they'd turn punishment into treasure, and in doing so, they'd saved each other. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and destiny collide in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you stories like these. Your support means everything to us.